Well, reports today of major advancements for the Russian forces and breaking through what's left of the Ukrainian army. Breakthrough spots are being reported, frankly, all over the place. Someone who predicted this would happen is Colonel Douglas Macgregor. In fact, a few days ago, wrote a new column, a new piece, so he put it down in print and said this, quote, "Today, more than 100,000 Russian troops are conducting offensive operations along the Lyman-Kupiansk axis. These forces include 900 tanks, 555 artillery systems, 370 multiple rocket launchers. It doesn't take much imagination to anticipate the breakthrough of these forces to the north, where they can then encircle Kharkiv." And Colonel Douglas Macgregor joins us now. So it appears, Colonel, that you were spot on looking into your crystal ball a few days ago. This amassing of forces appears that these breakthroughs have been happening over the past 24 hours in multiple spots. Not a surprise to you, though.
No, but I think all of this is pointing to a series of developments that we now have to look at carefully. Vilnius gave us a glimpse. What we saw at Vilnius was the Europeans have had it with Ukraine. Let's be frank. They are at a point now where they realize Ukraine cannot win. That's no longer a secret. And it was obvious from the body language and from some of the statements that the Europeans are looking for an off ramp. The real question at this point is whether or not the Biden administration is looking for an off ramp. I rather suspect they are. And why? The Ukrainian army is beginning to melt away. People need to understand that at some point, every army that goes to war at some point reaches the breaking point. In other words, it cracks under pressure. My friend Mike Vlahos, he and I discussed this war last December, and a lot of people enjoyed that discussion. But that's one of the points that he raises routinely with me. How much more can these Ukrainians take? When you're faced with overwhelming superiority and firepower, when you live essentially in a fishbowl, remember they've got constant, persistent surveillance from space-based assets as well as terrestrial assets. There's nowhere to hide. And if you concentrate in any number, anywhere, you can be targeted. And ultimately, some system, whether it sits in the Black Sea, whether it's inside Russia, whether it's inside southern Ukraine, or even up in Belarus, they can find you and strike you. So I think what we're watching is the disintegration of the Ukrainian military. Well, what do we do about it? I mean, that's the question. I think the opportunity for real escalation on NATO, on the side of NATO, is now no longer possible. And after all, where are our inventories of ammunition? How much ammunition have we got? What kind of medical infrastructure exists that could evacuate wounded? More important, how many ready combat formations do we have? I think the answers are all very, very negative. And under those circumstances, there's not a whole heck of a lot we can do. And then you have these outliers. The Poles, the Lithuanians keep insisting, well, we can go into Western Ukraine and, we'll gather territory that was once part of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth that went out of business in 1794. And Putin has responded very negatively, saying, well, if you come in under the NATO umbrella, you'll never leave. In other words, we'll bury you where you stand. And that's a pretty serious response, and it's one that everybody should take seriously. So I hope that people in Washington recognize two things. Ukraine has already lost the war. This is not going to be won. Ukraine is disintegrating. Its armed forces are falling apart. They're not bad people. They're not bad soldiers. They've done all that is humanly possible. The hundreds of thousands of dead and casualties is simply too much. All the hospitals are full. How many people they've got left that they could throw at the advancing Russians is anybody's guess, but I don't think it's very much. So the question now is, what do we do? Do we let this continue? How many more have to die before we finally say enough's enough? That's really where I think we are at this point.
You had a number of reports recently in the past 24, 48 hours about United States weapons that are pouring into Ukraine have overwhelmingly wound up on the black market. The Biden administration appears to, I'd like to think that they're looking for an off-ramp, but it appears that they continue to want to making these exceptions to send cluster munitions, which this weekend were raining down on journalists, killing journalists. I had one journalist who told me he made it out barely. His friend was killed because of these cluster munitions by Ukraine from the United States. Make no mistake about it. And so we continue to push this stuff in there into this meat grinder. For what purpose? So it appears, and then you have the Wall Street Journal this morning, a headline: Ukraine's lack of weaponry and training risks stalemate in fight with Russia. Risks a stalemate, right? They have a lack of weaponry. What do you make of this? So do you think that there's really an off-ramp for the Biden administration, or are they going to continue to throw more weapons down this drain?
Well, there's no stalemate coming, that's for sure, because the Ukrainians are losing and the Russians are advancing, and the Russians can go all the way to the river, and if necessary, they can cross the river. Their mobilization, by the way, continues at a very steady pace. It's not being covered publicly, but more and more and more men in various universities, in various technical institutes, in places where they would normally be working are missing. They're showing up in uniform. So the army continues to grow. Right now, the numbers of troops are about 750,000. You're talking about 300,000 of those in reserve. And a target number is 1.2 million before this is over. So Russia is waxing, more and more powerfully with each passing day. So there will be no stalemate. The war is lost. Now, are we going to continue to send aid? I think at some point it will be suspended, but no one wants to say, gosh, I guess we were wrong, Morris. Russia was weak, or so we thought. I guess it's not. They're not incompetent. They're not stupid. And the other question will come up is, why has this taken so long for the Russians to finally move on the offensive? Well, Putin has always been extremely sensitive to taking any action that could lead to a confrontation between the United States and Russia. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want a confrontation with NATO, but he knows that ultimately that means us. That's the last thing in the world he wants. He's always wanted to get to the negotiating table, come to some sort of solution, and return to normalcy. We are the ones with our sidekicks in London who continually insist that there can be no negotiated solution. Well, if there's no negotiated solution, you just keep marching west. That's the Russian answer. And people say, oh, well, that can't happen. What do you mean it can't happen? What's going to stop them? That's the point. There is nothing out there right now. And if we decide to tell the Poles privately, okay, stick your toe in the water, cross the border, go to Lvov, what's going to happen? I think Lvov could easily end up being leveled. And the troops that try to come across, unless they are heavily defended by air and missile defense systems, they're going to be blown to smithereens.
And then you have this question, which you and I were speaking about offline, which is these 8 Russian generals being removed. So I know we're trying to wrap our heads around exactly what's happening here. So this is on the Russian side now. Reports over the weekend of 8 Russian generals being removed from command by General Shoigu. And I'll just mention a few of the names that I can even pronounce here. Well, I'll try my best. Like current General Mikhail Tablinsky. You have, yeah, I'm not going to even try this. But a number.
Popov.
Popov.
Yeah, that's fairly easy to pronounce.
Gostev.
He was one of these general officers who was extremely popular with his troops. Well, there are a number of different possibilities, and we're still trying to sort through this. I think, first of all, as soon as I heard about these 8 generals, some of whom, like Popov, are being removed for probably being overly aggressive. They seem to have been in the corner complaining about the slowness with which the Russians are approaching this war. They would like to see this thing terminated on terms that are created on the battlefield. In other words, let us go and finish the job, kind of thing. If that's true, then I think we should offer up at least 8 of our army generals right now. We'll make the switch because I'll bring them over here and put them to work. They'll do an infinitely better job than our generals because at least they'll be aggressive fighters. I don't know what's happening. I think that some of this has to do with Mr. Shoigu, who is the Minister of Defense. Some of it has to do with General Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff. Remember that Vladimir Putin is very close to both of those men. And those men have had difficulty with several of these generals from time to time. Whether or not this is justified or unjustified, I have no idea. But whenever you see general officers removed, or better, killed in combat, believe it or not, that's a healthy sign of a military establishment at war, because it means that someone is being removed for doing something that was either wrong or not turning in the right results.
Hmm.
In other words, people are being held accountable for what they do. That's good.
Hmm.
If they get killed, that is an inspiration to soldiers. I can tell you that from having seen that repeatedly in history. Every time a general officer is reported killed or wounded, soldiers are sort of enraged at the enemy because they're proud of the fact that their commander was sharing the danger with them. We don't seem to get that here in the United States. We think, oh, well, generals are supposed to be remote from the battlefield because we can't afford to lose any. If we lose, their big brains will lose the war. Well, that always turns out to be nonsense because, as Charles de Gaulle said, cemeteries are filled with indispensable men. So you can always find more talent, but we seem to overlook that. So we don't really know what's happening, but I suggest it's a little of all of the above. Some of these people have been a little too outspoken in their criticism. Some of these people haven't done their jobs to the satisfaction of people above them. But to say that this is evidence for an imminent collapse on the Russian side is
Right.
absurd.
And
No
I'll get you
chance.
I'll get you out of here on this, Colonel. We just learned a few minutes ago that Ukraine vows that they will continue to attack Moscow with continued drone attacks. This coming in from the Telegraph just a short time ago. Moscow was hit several times over the weekend. This has been ongoing. That Russian Defense Ministry building is believed to be the headquarters where this was targeted. No one was injured in the strikes, but Ukraine says they're going to continue these drone attacks against Moscow. What do you make of this?
These are acts of desperation. The two key words to describe the situation right now in Ukraine are very straightforward. One is desperation, the other is disintegration. Ukrainians are desperate. The Ukrainian government is. And they will do anything that they can with whatever they have to sort of strike back at Russia. The problem for them, of course, is this sort of thing doesn't help them at all. It makes matters far worse. And they're not focusing their attention on the forces in front of them that are breaking through and entering their country. That's where they should be focused. You kill the enemy that you've got in front of you. If you don't kill him, it doesn't matter what happens anywhere else, you're going to lose the fight. Well, they're losing that fight. And they can't even get their soldiers to stand and fight anymore because, frankly, they're tired of dying. And they're questioning the wisdom of doing it anymore because they don't trust the leadership in Kiev. I don't think they trust their own general officers. They don't trust their brigade commanders. They don't trust most of their officers. I think that's a huge problem right now on the ground for the Ukrainians.
And I should clarify, they say they're going to vow further attacks on Moscow and Crimea. So, which, if you want to win the hearts and minds of the people of Crimea back over again, the best way to win those people over is by bombing and killing them, I suppose.
Well, Crimea is the hub for a lot of military power that the Russians have, and they know that. But it's not going to change, the outcome. I mean, this is sort of the final act of defiance.
Yeah.
So I think what we ought to be thinking about right now is how do we bring this to some form of closure? What do you do about this man Zelensky? I mean, he's done everything the globalists and neocons wanted him to do. He's marched hundreds of thousands of his countrymen into war to be killed or wounded. He's maintained the fiction that he was winning and Ukraine would triumph for how long now? 560 days. What are you going to do with him? Can he negotiate an end to this war? Seems unlikely to me. So I would watch and see what now happens with Zelensky and the people around him. Because if this is going to end before Ukraine as a nation state completely goes out of existence, someone in Ukrainian uniform probably has to step forward and take responsibility and ask for some sort of ceasefire and withdraw to some lines that people make on maps until talks can be arranged in Moscow or wherever they decide to hold them, probably back in Belarus, I would suspect.
I think you're spot on about this. As usual, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, thank you for the piece that you just wrote as well over at the Kennedy Beacon on Substack. We'll link it up in the description below. A number of really great points in this piece. And thank you, as always, for your analysis. And I think that is the ultimate question. What happens towards this off-ramp, and how can we move away from this without sending more people to die and more munitions that are going to be used against journalists and civilians? That's where things are winding up. Colonel, great to see you. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you, Morris.